The morning Violet Westbridge arrived at Ironcliff, it was raining, not the gentle, forgiving kind of rain that washes things clean. This was the grey, relentless kind, the kind that soaks through wool and settles into bones and makes a person feel, with quiet certainty, that the world has no interest in making things easy for them. She stood at the iron gate with a single trunk, a letter of introduction folded inside her coat pocket, and the particular stillness of someone who has already made peace with a decision she cannot undo. Her gloves were slightly damp. Her chin was level. If she was afraid, she had arranged her face so carefully around that fear that even she had stopped noticing it. The house rose from the Hudson Valley hillside, like something that had always been there and always would be. Stone walls 3 feet thick, windows tall and narrow as courtroom judges, chimneys stacked in pairs against a sky the color of pewter. It was not a home. It was a declaration. Every angle of Ironcliff said the same thing, quietly and without apology. I have already won. A servant met her at the gate. No warmth, no ceremony. He took her trunk without a word and led her up the gravel path at a pace that made clear she was expected, not welcomed. She did not ask his name. She focused on the sound of her own footsteps on wet stone and kept her breathing even. Thomas Everleigh was in his study when they told him she had arrived. He did not look up from the document on his desk. "Have Mrs. Aldridge show her to the East Wing," he said. "I'll see her at 4. The clock on the mantel read 9:30 in the morning. He returned to the document. A rail contract. 47 pages, dense with clauses, each one a small battlefield in its own right. He had read it 3 times already. He would read it again. That was how he worked. Not by instinct or intuition, but by repetition, by pressure, by refusing to let a single line escape his attention. His father had built Everleigh steel on iron and fire. Thomas had expanded it on patience and the precise surgical application of leverage. He was not thinking about the woman in the East Wing. He was thinking about the rail contract and the meeting on Friday and the particular vulnerability of a man named Gerald Ashford who did not yet understand how much Thomas already knew about his debts. That was the job. That was always the job. The world was full of men who confused confidence with security, and Thomas Everleigh had built a fortune on the space between those two things. He picked up his pen and made a notation in the margin. Small, precise, in the handwriting of someone who has never once written in a hurry. Outside, the rain continued. Violet had heard things about Thomas Everleigh, of course. Everyone had. That he had turned $40,000 into $4 million before he was 30. That he had once walked out of a board meeting, purchased the building the meeting was held in, and had the locks changed before the other directors reached the lobby. That he had been engaged briefly to a senator's daughter, and that the engagement had ended so quietly and so completely that the senator's daughter herself reportedly declined to discuss it. Not out of heartbreak, people said, but out of a kind of bewildered relief. Cold, people said. Controlled. Brilliant in the way that certain machines are brilliant, flawlessly efficient, and entirely indifferent to what they cost. She had not expected to feel anything particular when she arrived. Standing in the East Wing bedroom, which was large and impeccably furnished and carried the faint, unlived-in quality of a room in an expensive hotel, she felt something she had not anticipated. Not fear, not resentment. Something quieter and more unsettling than either of those. She felt the specific loneliness of a place where no one has ever allowed themselves to be lonely. It was in the furniture, the way every object was precisely positioned, not for comfort, but for order. The fireplace clean and unlit, the curtains drawn to exactly the same width on both sides, a vase of white flowers on the writing table, fresh, clearly arranged by someone following instructions rather than instinct. Someone had made this room perfect, because perfection required less of a person than warmth did. Violet set her coat on the chair nearest the window. She stood there for a long moment, looking out at the grounds below. The iron-grey lawns, the stone fountain in the center of the east garden, the line of bare oaks along the far wall, and thought about her father. William Westbridge had been a good man. She believed that. She needed to believe it because the alternative, that a good man could still make the choices he had made, could still leave the wreckage he had left, was harder to hold than grief. He had been a physician in Albany, respected, not wealthy but steady, the kind of man who kept careful ledgers, paid his accounts on time, and read aloud to his daughters on Sunday evenings from whatever book he happened to be working through that month. He had a quiet laugh and a habit of folding his hands when he was thinking, and a deep, unshowy faith that the world could be navigated with decency if a person was willing to be patient enough. And then he had borrowed money. First a modest sum, for necessary repairs to his practice, then more when a patient died under circumstances that required legal defense, then more still when the defense failed and the judgment was entered, and the creditors began arriving at the door with the practiced, unhurried manner of men who know they will eventually be paid. Each loan had seemed at the time like a solution. Together they had become something else entirely. He had died 8 months ago, quietly, in his sleep, the way good men sometimes did, when they had quietly run out of room. What he left behind was not nothing. It was worse than nothing. It was a specific, documented, legally enforceable debt of $31,000, owed through a chain of transactions that had taken Violet 3 months and the help of a retired clerk named Mr. Farrow to fully trace to a holding company that was, at its core, a subsidiary of Everleigh Steel. She had requested a meeting with the company's legal office. She had not expected to be granted one. She had been granted one. And at the end of a short formal exchange in a downtown office that smelled of wood smoke and lemon oil, she had been told that Mr. Everleigh himself would see her the following Thursday. She had dressed carefully for that meeting, not to impress, to be taken seriously, which was a different thing. The office on the 17th floor of the Everleigh building had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city with the unhurried confidence of something that owned the view. Thomas Everleigh had been standing at those windows when she entered, which she would later understand was simply how he occupied a room. Not seated, waiting, but upright, watching. He had turned and looked at her, directly, briefly, without performance. "Miss Westbridge," he said. "Mr. Everleigh." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He did not immediately. He moved to his desk with the unhurried economy of someone who has never once felt the need to fill silence, and then he sat, and he looked at her again with that same flat, careful attention. "Your father's debt does not transfer to you under current law," he said. "You are not legally obligated." "I know," she said. "Then you understand that whatever you came here to discuss is not a legal matter." "It's a moral one," she said. "He was my father." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. Not warmth, not quite, but a kind of recalibration, as though she had said something he had not calculated for. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was gone. He had told her then, with the same level tone he might use to describe a rail acquisition, that he required a wife, not a romantic one, a practical one, someone capable of managing a household, conducting herself appropriately at social functions, and understanding that his position in the city demanded a particular kind of visible stability. He had been advised on this point repeatedly, by people whose advice he generally respected. "I have found the process of identifying a suitable candidate to be—" He paused, briefly. "Inefficient." She had almost smiled. She had not. He had slid the contract across the desk. Clean pages, clear language. 2 years. The debt absorbed in full upon signing. A dissolution clause that protected her reputation completely. An allowance, specified to the dollar, for personal expenses. No emotional obligations. Nothing implied. Everything written. She had taken it home. She had read it twice alone at the kitchen table, with the kind of attention her father had always told her to give to anything that mattered. She had found no traps, no hidden clauses, just the clean, cold architecture of a transaction. She had signed it the next morning, not because she had no choice. She had choices. They were simply worse. At 4 o'clock she came downstairs. He was standing at the window of his study again, facing the east garden. He turned when she entered. He looked at her, the same brief, direct assessment as before, and said her name. Mrs. Everleigh. It landed differently than she expected. Not badly. Just solidly, like a door closing. "Mr. Everleigh," she said. He told her that Mrs. Aldridge would review the household schedule with her in the morning, that there were social engagements in the following month requiring her attendance, that he would provide the relevant information in advance. His voice was even, courteous, and entirely without unnecessary warmth. Then he returned to his desk. She understood she had been dismissed. She walked back through the corridor alone. The rain had eased slightly. The house was very quiet. She reached her room, sat on the edge of the bed, placed one hand on her trunk and did not open it. Inside, beneath the second layer of folded clothing, was a letter. It had arrived 3 days before the wedding, postmarked from a city 2 states away, written in the hand of Mr. Farrow, the retired clerk who had helped her trace the debt. He had found something else, he wrote, something that had not been in the original documents, something that changed the shape of everything. She had not opened the inner envelope yet. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. Sitting now in the dim quiet of Ironcliff, she understood, for the first time, that there might not be one. She folded her hands in her lap, just like her father used to do when he was thinking, and stared at the trunk, and let the weight of what she was carrying settle fully into her bones. 2 years, she had told herself. She was no longer sure that was the right measure of time. The first week at Ironcliff had a structure to it. Violet learned that structure the way you learn the layout of an unfamiliar house in the dark, slowly, by touch, by the occasional sharp corner you didn't see coming. Breakfast was served at 7:30 in the east dining room. Thomas was never there. He ate earlier, alone, in his study, before the rest of the household had fully woken. Luncheon was informal, a tray if she wanted one or nothing at all, which seemed to be his preference on most days. Dinner was at 7 in the evening, in the main dining room, and that was the one meal they shared. Those dinners were the architecture of their arrangement made visible. The table was long enough to seat 14. They sat at opposite ends of it. The candles were always lit. The silver was always polished. Mrs. Eldridge ran the household with the quiet precision of someone who had long ago decided that the best domestic service was the kind that made itself invisible, and so the meals appeared and were cleared away with a seamlessness that made the silences between courses feel deliberate rather than accidental. Thomas spoke when there was something to say. He was not rude. He was not dismissive. He asked on the third evening whether the east wing was comfortable. She said it was. He nodded and returned to his meal. On the 5th evening he mentioned, without preamble, that there would be a dinner the following Saturday at the Harrington estate. The Harringtons being, as he explained in the same tone one might use to describe a business arrangement, among the 4 or 5 families whose social goodwill had direct bearing on certain negotiations he was currently managing. "I'll need you to be present," he said. "Engaged. Visible." "Of course," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that brief, measuring look she was beginning to recognize. And then he said, "You don't need to perform anything. Just be what you are." She wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. She thought about it for the rest of the evening and arrived at no satisfying conclusion. What she was in those first weeks was observant. It was her oldest habit, the one that had served her best. Her father had called it her gift, and her mother, in the rare moments she spoke of such things, had called it her guard. Violet preferred not to name it at all. It was simply the thing she did. She watched, and she noted, and she filed things away with the patience of someone who understood that most information only becomes useful in retrospect. She watched Thomas Everleigh. He rose before dawn every morning. She knew this because she was a light sleeper, and Ironcliff, for all its stone weight, carried sound in unexpected ways. The creak of the study door below her room, the faint shift of floorboards, the distant scratch of a pen that she eventually learned to distinguish from the settling of the house itself. He worked for several hours before the rest of the staff arrived. When she came downstairs at 7, the evidence of those hours was always there. Papers moved, a coffee cup rinsed and turned upside down on the kitchen shelf, occasionally a single light still burning in the study hallway, even after he had moved on to other rooms. He was not a man who rested easily. She filed that away. He was also, she noticed, precise about small things in ways that suggested the precision was not performance, but need. His books were organized not alphabetically, but by subject, and within each subject by the date he had acquired them. She had discovered this accidentally while looking for something to read, and had spent a quiet 15 minutes in the library simply looking at the spines and the small penciled dates on the inside covers, each one in the same controlled hand. His correspondence was answered within 24 hours without exception. The household staff moved around him with the practiced deference of people who had learned his rhythms and found it easier to work with them than against them. None of them seemed afraid of him. That was something she had not expected. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been with Ironcliff for 11 years and had the quiet authority of someone who has outlasted more than one version of the household, spoke of him with a directness that surprised Violet. "He's not easy," she said one morning, over the household accounts, "but he's fair, and he doesn't pretend to be something he isn't. There are worse things in an employer." Violet had nodded. She had thought, and in a husband. She had not said it. The Harrington dinner arrived on a cold Saturday evening, and Violet dressed for it with the careful deliberation of someone preparing for a kind of performance she had given before, just never quite like this. The other guests were exactly what she had expected. The Harringtons themselves were older money, the kind that had learned to wear itself lightly while never actually forgetting it was there. There were two other industrialists and their wives, a railroad attorney whose name she recognized from the newspapers, and a woman named Cecilia Vane who was the widow of a steel magnate, and who looked at Violet with the particular attention of someone cataloguing information they intend to use later. Thomas arrived at her side at precisely the right moments. He introduced her without flourish, my wife, Violet, and then stood close enough to signal partnership without performing it. He was good at this, she noticed, better than she would have guessed. He knew how to listen to a conversation while appearing to lead it, how to make a man feel that his opinion had been genuinely solicited when in fact the conversation had been steered there from the beginning. At one point during a discussion about the proposed rail expansion through the Northern Territories, he said something that made three men laugh. Not a forced laugh, but the real kind, surprised out of them, and she found herself looking at him from across the room with a feeling she could not immediately name. He caught her looking. He did not look away immediately, neither did she. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to be something too short to be deliberate, and then someone addressed him, and the moment closed. She turned back to her own conversation and felt, inexplicably, that the room was slightly warmer than it had been. It was on the carriage ride home that something shifted. They had been riding in silence for several minutes. Comfortable silence, she was beginning to think, though she was careful about calling anything comfortable too quickly, when he said, without turning from the window, "The Vane woman was watching you all evening." "I noticed," Violet said. "She'll make inquiries." "She does, about everyone new. What will she find?" He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing that concerns me," he said. "Your father's situation was handled through the holding company. It's not traceable to this marriage." She absorbed that. "You thought about that before?" "I think about everything before," he said. She looked at his profile against the dark window, the strong line of jaw, the faint tension that lived permanently in the set of his shoulders, and said carefully, "Is that exhausting?" He turned then, not sharply, just turned and looked at her, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the assessment, not the management. Something underneath those things, briefly visible. "Sometimes," he said. One word. He looked back at the window immediately after, as though the admission had surprised him as much as it had surprised her. She did not press it. She understood instinctively that pressing it would close the door she had just watched open a fraction of an inch. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than the ones before. 3 days later, she found the photograph. She had not been searching for anything. She had been looking for a book she had set down somewhere in the main corridor and retraced her steps through the east sitting room, which she rarely used, and in doing so passed the writing cabinet that stood between the two east-facing windows. The cabinet door was slightly ajar, unusual, because everything in Ironcliff was either fully open or fully closed, never halfway, and when she moved to push it shut, she saw, on the interior shelf, a small framed photograph that had been turned face down. She should not have touched it. She touched it. A woman, younger than Violet, or perhaps the same age. It was difficult to tell with photographs, dark-haired, sitting very straight in the kind of formal portrait pose that was standard for the era, but with an expression that had resisted the formality somehow, something in the eyes that was either laughter held back or sadness held back. She couldn't tell which. On the back, in handwriting that was not Thomas's, a single line. Ironcliff, 1881. 7 years ago. She set it back down, face down, exactly as she had found it. She pushed the cabinet door to its proper closed position and stood very still for a moment, her hand still on the dark wood, aware of a feeling moving through her that she did not entirely trust, something between curiosity and caution, with something else underneath both of those things that she chose not to examine too closely. She found her book on the hall table where she had left it. She did not mention the photograph to Thomas. That evening at dinner he was quieter than usual, which she had not thought was possible. He ate methodically and said very little. At one point he looked up from his plate and said, without particular inflection, "You were in the east sitting room today." It was not a question. "I was looking for my book," she said. Her voice was even. "I found it in the hall." He nodded, returned to his plate. She watched him and thought, he knows every room in this house. He knows when any of them have been entered. Not because he was suspicious of her specifically, because that was simply how he moved through the world, always aware, always accounting, never letting anything exist outside his knowledge. She thought about the letter in her trunk. She thought about what Mr. Farrow had written, and what the inner envelope almost certainly contained, and the fact that she had been in this house for nearly 3 weeks now and had still not opened it. She told herself it was because she needed to be certain before she acted on anything. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that something about Ironcliff had begun to settle into her, not comfort, not belonging, but something she recognized from the very first day, something that lived in the 2 perfect rooms and the pre-dawn lamplight and the carriage window, and sometimes said in a voice that had not expected to say it. She was starting to understand him, and understanding a person she knew from experience was the most dangerous thing you could do when you were also keeping something from them. She went to bed that night with the lamp burning. She did not open the trunk, but she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, in the quiet of Ironcliff, listening to the faint sound of papers turning in the study below, and she made herself a promise she was not sure she could keep. "Before the month is out," she told herself, "you will open that letter." The lamp burned down to half. The house settled around her like a held breath. Below her, without interruption, the pen continued its quiet and deliberate work. She opened it on a Tuesday morning while the house was still cold. The fire in her room had not yet been lit. She had been awake before Mrs. Aldridge made her rounds, which was becoming a habit she had not chosen, but could not seem to break. There was something about Ironcliff in those early hours, before the staff arrived, and the day arranged itself into its proper shape that felt different from the rest of the time. Quieter, but not in the empty way. Quiet in the way of a room where someone has just finished speaking, and the words are still settling. She sat at the writing table in her coat because the coat was warmer than waiting, and she opened the trunk. The letter was exactly where she had left it, beneath the second layer of clothing, folded inside a piece of plain brown paper that Mr. Farrow had used with the meticulous practicality of a man who had spent 40 years in the documentation of other people's affairs. She held it for a moment without opening it, not from hesitation exactly, but from the particular stillness that comes just before something changes and some part of you knows it. Then she opened it. Mr. Farrow's letter was 3 pages in his small, careful hand. He had continued looking, he wrote, after their last correspondence, not because she had asked him to, because he was constitutionally incapable of leaving an incomplete record, and the records he had found while tracing her father's debt had contained what he described as an irregularity that he could not, in good conscience, file away without bringing to her attention. Her father's first loan, the original sum, the one taken for repairs to the practice, had not come from a standard lending institution. It had come from a private instrument, a short-term note issued through a small financial intermediary based in Albany. That intermediary, Farrow had discovered, had been established in the spring of 1880 and dissolved by the winter of 1882. Its sole operating officer, listed in the incorporation documents, was a man named Daniel Crowe. Daniel Crowe, Farrow wrote, had been the personal financial secretary to Thomas Everleigh from 1879 until 1883. He had not stopped there. The intermediary had issued 43 loans during its 2 years of operation. Farrow had been able to trace 31 of them. Every single one had been made to men in vulnerable financial positions: physicians, small manufacturers, a county judge, a land surveyor, and every single one had carried terms that appeared reasonable at origination, but contained a compounding clause buried in the 3rd addendum, a clause that accelerated the debt in the event of any legal judgment against the borrower, regardless of the judgment's connection to the original loan. Her father's legal judgment for the patient who had died. That was what had triggered it, not the debt itself. The clause inside the debt, the one her father almost certainly had not understood when he signed. Farrow's final paragraph was short. "I cannot tell you what this means with certainty. I can tell you what it suggests. The instrument was designed to grow. It was designed to reach. And the man whose secretary built it has since absorbed the resulting debts into a holding structure that obscures the origin entirely. Whether he knew, whether he directed it, whether he was simply the beneficiary of someone else's mechanism, that I cannot determine from the documents alone. But I thought you should know the shape of the thing before you made any further decisions." Violet set the letter down on the writing table. She sat very still. Outside, the first grey light was beginning to come through the curtains. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint, familiar sound of movement in the study. Thomas, already at his desk, already at work, already running the quiet, invisible machinery of a life built entirely on control and documentation and the precise management of other people's exposure. She thought about his voice in the carriage. Sometimes. She thought about the photograph, face down in the cabinet. She thought about her father's hands folded on the kitchen table in Albany, patient and decent, and entirely unaware of the shape of what he had signed. She folded the letter back into its paper. She put it inside the lining of her winter coat, which she kept in the wardrobe behind everything else. Then she went downstairs to breakfast and said good morning to Mrs. Aldridge, and ate her toast and drank her tea and looked out the window at the east garden with the expression of someone thinking about nothing in particular. She was, in fact, thinking about everything. The days that followed had a strange quality to them. She knew something he did not know she knew. That was the simple version of it. But simple versions of things, she had learned, had a way of expanding under pressure until they revealed their actual dimensions, and the actual dimensions of this particular thing were considerable. If Thomas had known about Crow's instrument, if he had directed it or designed it, or simply allowed it to function because it funneled money toward his empire, then the debt that had brought her to Ironcliff was not the result of her father's bad luck and worse judgment. It was the result of a mechanism, a system, something built to catch exactly the kind of man her father had been, and she had signed a contract with the man who had built it, and she was living in his house. And she was, by every legal and social measure, his wife. She went about her days. She reviewed the household accounts with Mrs. Aldridge. She attended a luncheon at the Harrington house with 3 other women whose conversation moved between charity organization business and the careful coded evaluation of one another's marriages. She walked the grounds every afternoon, regardless of the weather, because movement helped her think, and Ironcliff's grounds were extensive enough that she could walk for 40 minutes without passing the same point twice. On one of those afternoons, she rounded the northeast corner of the house and found Thomas standing at the edge of the stone terrace, looking out over the valley below. He was not doing anything. He was simply standing there, coat on, hands in his pockets, looking at the distance with an expression she had not seen in any of the managed, purposeful moments she had observed him in before. He looked tired. Not physically. Tired in a way that lived deeper than the body. He heard her footsteps and turned, and the expression rearranged itself immediately, not into coldness, but into the familiar, composed neutrality. But she had seen it. 2 seconds, maybe 3. "Mrs. Everleigh," he said. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said. "You didn't." He looked back at the valley for a moment. "I come out here when the correspondence becomes circular. It clears the head." She stopped a few feet away from him and looked out at the same view, the long slope of the valley, the dark line of the river far below, the hills on the opposite side going grey and amber in the late afternoon light. It was beautiful. She had not let herself think that word in relation to anything at Ironcliff, but standing here now with the cold air and the wide sky, and the quiet that was not lonely, but simply large, she thought it. "It's a remarkable piece of land," she said. "My father chose it," Thomas said. A pause. "He said a man should be able to see far enough from his own house to know what was coming." There was something in the way he said it. Not sentiment exactly. He did not do sentiment, or had not in her presence, but the weight of a thing long carried. "Did it work?" she asked. "Could he see what was coming?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "but he believed it. Which I think served the same purpose." She looked at him. He was still looking at the valley. She thought about Mr. Farrow's letter. She thought about Daniel Crow. She thought about the question she had been turning over for days, like a stone she was not yet ready to look under. Not what did he do, but who did he have to become to do it, or to allow it, or to simply not ask? She did not ask any of those things. She said instead, "What was his name, your father?" Thomas turned and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been asked a question in a room they did not expect to be asked questions in. "Edmund," he said. "Did you get on?" Another pause, longer this time. "We understood each other," he said finally. "That's a different thing." She nodded. She knew the difference. They stood in silence for another minute or two. Not the dinner table silence, not the managed silence of 2 people performing coexistence, but something else. Something that had come into existence without either of them deciding to allow it. Then he said, "You're cold." She had not realized she was shivering slightly. "I'm fine." "Go inside," he said, not unkindly, just as directly in the way he said everything. She went. That evening at dinner, he looked up from his plate midway through the meal and said, "There's a matter I need to discuss with you. Not tonight, but before the end of the week." "Of course," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the measuring look, but different now. Or perhaps she was reading it differently. "You've settled in well," he said. "Better than I expected." "What did you expect?" she asked. before she had fully decided to. He considered the question with the same seriousness he appeared to give everything. "Someone more uncomfortable," he said. "I may be more uncomfortable than I appear," she said. Something moved in his expression. Very briefly, "Yes," he said. "I'm beginning to think that's possible." He returned to his meal. She returned to hers. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. The matter he had wanted to discuss arrived sooner than the end of the week. The following morning, before breakfast, Mrs. Aldridge brought a note to her room. Thomas's handwriting on the outside. Brief, inside, 3 lines asking her to come to the study at 9 o'clock, and mentioning that a man named Harlan Reed would be present, and that Reed was the senior attorney for Everleigh Steel, and that the meeting concerned a contractual matter she should be aware of. She read the note twice. Harlan Reed. She knew that name. She had seen it at the bottom of the original contract, the one she had signed in the downtown office, the one that had brought her here. He had notarized it. She dressed carefully. She went downstairs at 9. Thomas was at his desk. Reed was in the chair across from it, a compact man in his late 50s, with the air of someone who had spent a career making complicated things sound straightforward. He rose when she entered. Thomas did not rise, but he looked at her in a way that was, she thought, the closest thing to an apology she had yet seen from him, though she could not have said exactly why she read it that way. "There's been a development," Thomas said, "regarding the holding company through which your father's debt was absorbed." She sat down in the empty chair beside Reed. She folded her hands in her lap. She kept her face composed. "A journalist," Reed said, with the tone of a man describing a weather event, "has been making inquiries into the history of a financial intermediary that operated out of Albany in the early part of the decade. We believe he has partial documentation." Violet said nothing. "The concern," Thomas said, watching her, "is that if this becomes a public matter, the connection between the holding company and the original instrument will surface, and from there—" He stopped. "From there it connects to this marriage," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. And in that moment, sitting in the study of Ironcliff with the morning light coming through the tall windows and Harlan Reed's pen hovering above his notepad, Violet Westbridge understood that she was no longer the only person in this room who was carrying something they had not yet found the right moment to say. The question was which of them would speak first, and what would be left standing afterward. The silence in the study lasted exactly long enough to become irreversible. Violet looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Violet. Reed looked at his notepad with the practiced discretion of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where the most important conversations happened in the spaces between spoken words. Then Violet reached into the interior pocket of her coat. She had brought it deliberately. She had made that decision before she came downstairs, before she read the note a second time, before she dressed and composed her face and walked into this room. She had made it the moment she understood, standing in front of the wardrobe, that the meeting Thomas had called and the secret she had been carrying had finally arrived at the same point. There was no longer a version of this morning in which the letter stayed hidden. There was only the question of how it came out, managed or broken, on her terms or on someone else's. She set Mr. Farrow's letter on the desk. Thomas looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes without having seen it before, the shape of a thing he has been on some level expecting. "You should read it," she said. "Both of you." Reed picked it up first with Thomas's slight nod of permission. He read it in silence. His expression did not change, but his breathing slowed in the way of someone absorbing impact. He set it on the desk, and Thomas took it without a word and read it with the same stillness he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, giving nothing away. When he finished, he set it down. He placed both hands flat on the desk. He looked at the middle distance for a long moment, and Violet watched something move through him that she had no name for. Not guilt, not anger, not the cold management she had come to know. Something older than any of those things, something that lived underneath the empire and the contract and the iron composure, in the part of a person that existed before they decided who to become. "Daniel Crowe acted independently," Thomas said. His voice was level. "I did not design that instrument. I did not know the specifics of how it was structured." "But you knew Crowe," she said. "Yes, and when the debts came to the holding company, when 31 loans arrived in your books over the course of 2 years, you did not ask where they originated." He was quiet. "Mr. Everleigh," she said, and her voice was not hard, but it was not soft either. It was simply precise. "You did not ask." "No," he said, "I did not ask. The admission was quiet, smaller than she expected, and somehow, because of its smallness, more complete than a defense would have been. Reed set down his pen. He looked at Thomas with the expression of a man who had given 30 years of counsel and had learned that some mornings arrived beyond the reach of legal architecture. "The journalist," Violet said, "will publish what he has regardless of what happens in this room." "Likely," Reed said. "Then the question is not how to prevent it," she said. "The question is what Thomas does before it arrives." Both men looked at her. She had thought about this. She had thought about it on every one of those afternoon walks, through the amber and grey of the Ironcliff grounds, turning the problem over and over, until she could see all of its sides clearly. She was her father's daughter in most ways that mattered. She believed in decency, in ledgers that balanced, in debts acknowledged rather than obscured. But she was also 3 months of legal documents and one very long winter, and she understood that the world did not reward the clean gesture simply because it was clean. "The 31 families," she said, "the ones who borrowed through Crow's instrument. Most of the debts were absorbed into the holding company, which means they are at present still owed." "Technically, yes," Reed said carefully. "Forgive them," she said. Thomas looked at her. "All 31, she said. "Document it properly. Make it a matter of public record, not a press announcement, not a performance, a legal record, filed before the journalist publishes a single word." She paused. "It won't save the reputation entirely. It won't make what Crow built disappear. But it changes the shape of the story. It means that when the instrument is exposed, the response already exists, and the response is not defense, it is correction." The room was very quiet. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, and could not fully read. It was not the assessment, not the management, not even the brief, unguarded tiredness she had glimpsed on the terrace. It was something more direct than any of those things, like a man looking at a room he had thought he knew, and finding in the far corner a window he had never noticed. "That is not a small financial concession," Reed said. "No," Violet agreed. "It isn't." Thomas stood. He moved to the window, the east garden window, the one he always moved to when he was thinking, and stood with his back to them for a moment. She watched the line of his shoulders, the permanent tension in them that she had catalogued over weeks of careful observation. Then he said, "Draw up the documents, Harlan." Reed nodded once. He began writing. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic. That was the thing about consequences, Violet had learned. The real ones, the ones that lasted, rarely announced themselves with the volume the moment seemed to require. They arrived quietly, in the form of paperwork and revised ledgers and conversations in downtown offices that ended differently than they were supposed to. The journalist published his piece on a Thursday. By Thursday morning, the legal filings were already recorded. By Thursday evening, 3 of the city's 4 major newspapers had the counter-story. Reed had handled the documentation with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the only thing more powerful than a damaging truth was a damaging truth that had already been answered. The damage came anyway. It always did. 2 of the Northern Rail contracts were suspended pending review. A bank that had extended Everleigh Steel a significant line of credit called a meeting that did not go well. Gerald Ashford, the man Thomas had been outmaneuvering for months, used the week's instability to consolidate 2 board positions that had been in play. The empire did not fall, but it contracted, and in the particular world Thomas Everleigh had built, contraction was its own kind of falling. He came to her sitting room on the Sunday evening of that week. He knocked, which he had never done before. She said, "Come in." And he came in and stood near the door with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the directness that was, she understood now, his most honest mode. "The forgiveness of the debts was your counsel," he said. "It shaped the outcome materially. I want to acknowledge that." "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I also want to acknowledge that you had that letter for weeks before you used it." "Yes. You could have used it differently. Earlier." "I could have," she said. "I chose not to." He was quiet. "Why?" She considered the question. Not because she didn't know the answer, she had known it for some time, but because she wanted to give it to him accurately, without excess or softening. "Because I needed to understand who you were before I decided what the letter meant," she said. "A document tells you what a person did. It doesn't tell you what they're capable of." He absorbed that. The tension in his shoulders shifted, not disappeared, but changed quality, like something that had been braced against impact, slowly recognizing that the impact had already come and passed. "The contract," he said, "the 2-year clause." "I remember the terms," she said. "There are 11 months remaining." I know. He looked at her across the sitting room, the impeccably furnished, unlived-in sitting room that had been slowly, over the course of the winter, acquiring the small evidence of actual habitation. Her books on the side table, her reading lamp positioned at the wrong angle for decoration, but the right angle for use, a pair of her gloves on the chair by the window, left there and not retrieved, which in the early weeks of Ironcliff would have felt like a violation of some unspoken rule, but which now simply looked like a glove on a chair. "I am not going to ask you to stay," he said. "The contract permits you to leave, and I will honor it without condition." "I know that too," she said. "I am also not able to tell you that I—" He stopped, started again, with the careful precision of a man navigating language he did not have practiced roots through. "I am not able to tell you with confidence what I would have done in 1881 if I had known exactly what Crow was building." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. She recognized it as such. It cost him something, she could see that, and he had offered it anyway, without the assurance of knowing what she would do with it. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know that too," she said quietly. He nodded. He moved to leave, and then he stopped, with his hand near the door frame, not touching it, and he said without turning, "For what it's worth, the woman I needed when I wrote that contract and the woman who put that letter on my desk are not the same woman." "No," she said. "They aren't." He left. She sat in the lamplight and listened to his footsteps move down the corridor, and thought about everything that had been said, and everything that had not been said, and the 11 months remaining, and the particular, unresolvable nature of a thing that was neither finished nor continuing, but something in between, something that had no name in the contract, because the contract had never been written for it. Outside, the winter was beginning, finally, to soften. Ironcliff stood as it always had, stone and weight and the long view over the valley. But the man who lived in it had been seen, and that, it turned out, was the one thing his empire had never been built to survive.